Commander Elena Vasquez adjusted her worn leather jacket as she settled into seat 14C, her calloused fingers briefly touching the small eagle pin hidden beneath the fabric. The businessman beside her wrinkled his nose at her faded jeans and scuffed boots, shifting away with obvious disdain. Behind her, two college students snickered about the woman who clearly couldn't afford first class. Elena closed her eyes, letting their assumptions wash over her like background noise. 20 years of military service had taught her that appearances often deceived, and today she preferred anonymity. The red-eye flight from San Diego to Norfolk would give her time to prepare for tomorrow's classified briefing at the Pentagon. The flight attendant, a perfectly coiffed woman named Patricia according to her name tag, approached with practiced politeness that barely masked her judgment. "Ma'am, I need to remind you that alcoholic beverages from outside the aircraft aren't permitted," Patricia said, eyeing Elena's thermos with suspicion. "It's coffee," Elena replied quietly, unscrewing the cap to reveal the dark liquid steaming inside. Patricia's cheeks flushed pink as she hurried away. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've seen military aircraft in your skies. Elena had no idea that within hours, her quiet journey home would become anything but ordinary. The Boeing 737 climbed steadily through the night sky, its engines humming their familiar rhythm. Elena gazed out the small window at the scattered lights below, each one representing lives unaware of the complexity above their heads. Her trained ear caught subtle variations in the engine's tone that most passengers would never notice. The businessman beside her had fallen asleep, his laptop still open to a presentation about quarterly projections. How simple his world seemed, Elena thought, where the biggest emergency might be a missed connection or delayed baggage. She remembered when her own concerns had been equally straightforward, before flight school, before combat missions, before carrying secrets that could shift the balance of international relations. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, smooth and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently cruising at 35,000 feet with clear skies ahead. Our estimated arrival time in Norfolk remains on schedule." Elena knew that voice carried more tension than it revealed. Subtle clues in his inflection suggested he was monitoring something beyond routine flight parameters. Her fingers unconsciously traced the outline of her military identification card tucked deep in her wallet. Patricia returned, offering packaged peanuts with the same forced smile she'd worn earlier. The flight attendant's movements seemed slightly more hurried now, her eyes darting toward the cockpit more frequently than normal. Elena accepted the snack politely, noting how Patricia's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she moved down the aisle. The first sign of trouble came as a barely perceptible shudder through the aircraft's frame. Elena felt it instantly, her body attuned to mechanical irregularities after thousands of flight hours. Most passengers continued their conversations or dozed peacefully, unaware that something had shifted in the delicate balance keeping them aloft. Elena's eyes moved to the wing outside her window. The navigation lights blinked their steady pattern, but she noticed the aileron's position seemed slightly off. Her pilot's instincts kicked in, cataloging details that civilian passengers couldn't recognize as warning signs. The businessman stirred beside her, briefly opening his eyes before settling back into sleep. Behind her, the college students had plugged in earbuds, lost in their own worlds of music and movies. Their innocence felt both precious and fragile to Elena, who understood how quickly routine flights could transform into life-threatening emergencies. Patricia moved through the cabin again, but her professional demeanor had developed hairline cracks. She fumbled slightly with the beverage cart, her usual efficiency replaced by barely controlled anxiety. When a passenger asked for extra ice, Patricia's response came a beat too late, her mind clearly elsewhere. Captain Morrison's voice returned to the intercom, and this time Elena caught the subtle strain he was working to conceal. "Folks, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Nothing to worry about, but we may need to adjust our altitude slightly for optimal performance." Elena knew that minor technical difficulties was pilot code for something far more serious. The aircraft's descent began so gradually that most passengers remained unaware, but Elena felt the subtle pressure change in her ears immediately. Through her window, she watched the altimeter on the wing's leading edge, noting they were dropping faster than any routine altitude adjustment would require. Patricia appeared at the front of the cabin, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of whatever crisis was unfolding in the cockpit. She whispered urgently into her headset, glancing repeatedly at the passenger manifest in her trembling hands. Elena caught fragments of the conversation, enough to understand they were discussing emergency protocols. The businessman finally woke as turbulence jolted the aircraft more violently than before. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice sharp with the first hints of panic. Patricia forced another smile, assuring him it was just routine weather avoidance. But Elena could see the fear growing behind her practiced facade. In the seats ahead, other passengers began to notice the unusual movement. Conversations shifted from casual topics to nervous speculation about the flight's increasingly erratic behavior. The college students behind Elena pulled out their earbuds, suddenly alert to the tension spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Elena remained outwardly calm, but her military training had her mind racing through emergency scenarios. She calculated fuel consumption rates, estimated their current position over the dark landscape below, and considered the limited options available to Captain Morrison. Whatever was wrong, it was serious enough that standard procedures weren't resolving the problem. The oxygen masks dropped without warning, yellow plastic cups dangling from the ceiling like bizarre party decorations. Screams erupted throughout the cabin as passengers fumbled with the straps, their panic spreading faster than the crew could manage. Elena calmly secured her own mask first, then helped the businessman beside her who was hyperventilating with terror. Patricia's voice came over the intercom, no longer able to hide her fear. "Please remain calm and follow the safety instructions. Secure your own mask before assisting others." The flight attendant's hands shook as she demonstrated the procedure she performed countless times in training, but never in a real emergency. Through the chaos, Elena heard the distinctive sound of the aircraft's backup systems engaging. The engine noise had changed again, becoming more labored and irregular. She recognized the symptoms of a cascading failure, where one problem triggered others in a dangerous chain reaction that could quickly overwhelm even experienced pilots. The college students behind her were crying now, clutching each other as the aircraft continued its uncomfortable descent. Around the cabin, passengers pulled out their phones, desperately trying to send final messages to loved ones despite the lack of signal at their altitude. Elena closed her eyes and focused on the aircraft's behavior, feeling every vibration and movement through her body. Her years of combat flying had taught her to read an aircraft like a living thing, understanding its distress signals and limitations. What she felt now told her that Captain Morrison was fighting a losing battle against forces beyond normal pilot training. Captain Morrison's voice returned, stripped of all pretense now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing multiple system failures and will be making an emergency landing. Please assume the brace position and follow all crew instructions immediately." The cabin erupted in fresh panic. Passengers who had maintained composure finally broke down, their sobs mixing with frantic prayers and desperate phone calls. The businessman beside Elena gripped his armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white, muttering about his daughter's wedding next weekend. Elena unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, moving against the crowd's hysteria. Patricia blocked her path, shouting above the chaos. "Ma'am, you must return to your seat immediately. We cannot have passengers moving around during an emergency." "I can help," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that cut through the noise. Patricia shook her head frantically, insisting that only trained crew members could assist during emergencies. The flight attendant's training had taught her to maintain control, but she had no idea she was refusing help from someone with more aviation experience than the entire crew combined. Behind them, Other passengers began shouting demands and accusations. Why didn't the pilots catch this earlier? What kind of maintenance does this airline do? Their fear had transformed into anger, seeking someone to blame for their terror. Elena returned to her seat, but kept watching the crew's increasingly desperate attempts to manage a situation that was spiraling beyond their capabilities. Every instinct told her to act, but she remained trapped by protocols and assumptions. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, throwing passengers against their seat belts and sending loose items flying across the cabin. Elena felt the unmistakable sensation of a complete hydraulic failure, something that would challenge even the most experienced military pilots. Through her window, she could see the wing flaps stuck in an awkward position, confirming her worst fears. Patricia stumbled down the aisle, her professional facade completely shattered. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to comfort passengers who were beyond consolation. The college students behind Elena had gone silent, holding hands and staring wide-eyed at the chaos around them. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom one more time, his words clipped and urgent. "We have lost primary flight controls and are currently flying on manual backup systems only. We are declaring a full emergency and requesting immediate priority landing clearance." Elena knew what those words meant. Manual backup systems in a commercial aircraft were never designed to handle the complex approach patterns required for safe landings. The pilots were essentially flying a multi-ton glider with limited control authority, trying to bring it down safely before their options ran out completely. The businessman turned to Elena, his face pale with recognition of their dire situation. "We're not going to make it, are we?" he whispered. Elena met his eyes, seeing the terror there, and for the first time considered revealing who she really was. But breaking her cover meant exposing classified information, and military protocols ran deep in her blood. A child's scream from the front of the cabin shattered Elena's internal debate. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, had broken free from her mother's grip and was running down the aisle in pure terror. Patricia lunged to catch her, but missed, and the child stumbled as the aircraft shuddered again. Elena moved without thinking, catching the girl before she could fall. As she lifted the trembling child, Elena's leather jacket fell open, revealing the silver wings pinned to her shirt beneath. The little girl's eyes widened, focusing on the familiar symbol she'd seen in movies about brave pilots. "Are you a pilot?" the child whispered through her tears. Elena hesitated for a moment that felt like eternity, then nodded slowly. The little girl's mother appeared, her face a mixture of gratitude and sudden recognition as she too spotted the wings. Patricia had witnessed the exchange and now stared at Elena with new understanding. The flight attendant's training had taught her to recognize military insignia, and those wings represented something far beyond civilian aviation credentials. "You're military," Patricia breathed, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. Elena met her eyes and nodded again, feeling the weight of her decision settling around her like a familiar uniform. The businessman beside Elena's empty seat had overheard everything. He stood up shakily and called out to the other passengers. "She's a pilot. This woman is actually a pilot." The words spread through the cabin like wildfire, and suddenly dozens of desperate faces turned toward Elena with a mixture of hope and pleading. Patricia grabbed Elena's arm with desperate urgency. "Please," she whispered, "we need to get you to the cockpit. Captain Morrison is trying everything, but we're running out of time and altitude." Elena could hear the defeat creeping into the flight attendant's voice, the growing certainty that conventional solutions were no longer sufficient. Elena gently handed the little girl back to her mother and followed Patricia toward the front of the aircraft. Behind them, passengers watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The businessman called out, "What kind of pilot are you? Are you qualified for this type of aircraft?" Elena paused at the cockpit door, her hand resting on the frame. 20 years naval aviation, she said clearly, her voice carrying to the passengers nearest her. Test pilot certification, combat experience, and instructor ratings on everything from fighters to transport aircraft. The cabin fell silent except for the labored sound of the struggling engines. Those credentials meant something even to civilian passengers who understood that military pilots face challenges far beyond anything commercial aviation typically encountered. Patricia knocked on the cockpit door, calling out the emergency override code. Captain Morrison's voice came through the intercom, strained and exhausted. "We have less than 15 minutes before we lose the ability to control our descent pattern. The engines are failing and our backup systems are compromised." Elena stepped forward, knowing that crossing the threshold into the cockpit would change everything. Once inside, she would become responsible for every life on board. But staying in the passenger cabin meant watching helplessly as everyone aboard faced almost certain catastrophe. The cockpit door opened to reveal Captain Morrison and his co-pilot wrestling with controls that barely responded to their commands. Sweat beaded on both men's foreheads as they fought to maintain even basic flight parameters. When Morrison saw Elena, his exhausted eyes showed a flicker of desperate hope. "Commander Elena Vasquez, United States Navy," Elena announced, her voice cutting through the chaos of alarms and warning lights. "Test pilot with carrier landing certifications and emergency procedure specialist. What's your current status?" Morrison's relief was palpable as he quickly briefed her on the cascade of failures. Hydraulic systems completely down, primary flight computers offline, and both engines operating at less than 60% efficiency. "We're essentially flying a brick with wings, and our glide ratio is deteriorating rapidly." Elena slipped into the observer seat and immediately began scanning the instrument panel. Her trained eyes processed information faster than the overwhelmed crew could relay it. She noticed patterns in the failure modes that suggested a solution the civilian pilots hadn't considered. "I need to contact Norfolk Naval Air Station immediately," Elena said, reaching for the radio. "They have emergency procedures for situations exactly like this, but I need to authenticate my identity first." Captain Morrison stared at her in amazement. "You mean there are protocols for this kind of catastrophic failure?" Elena nodded grimly. "In military aviation, we plan for scenarios that commercial pilots pray never happen. But those procedures require specific approach vectors and ground support that only military installations can provide." Elena keyed the radio with practiced precision. "Norfolk Naval Air Station. This is Commander Elena Vasquez aboard civilian flight 447 declaring emergency. Authentication code Bravo 7 Charlie 9. We have multiple system failures and require immediate military escort and emergency landing clearance." The response came instantly, crisp and professional. "Commander Vasquez, this is Norfolk Tower. We have your emergency declaration and are authenticating your credentials now. Stand by for escort deployment." Through the cockpit windows, Elena spotted them first, two sleek F-18 Super Hornets rising from the darkness below like guardian angels. Their navigation lights cut through the night as they took positions on either side of the struggling commercial aircraft, their pilots already coordinating with ground control. Captain Morrison watched in amazement as the military jets matched their speed and altitude perfectly. "I've never seen anything like this," he whispered. Elena smiled grimly as she took control of the communications. "This is standard protocol when a high-value military asset is aboard a civilian aircraft in distress." The lead F-18 pilot's voice crackled through their headset. "Commander, we have visual contact and are prepared to escort you to emergency landing. We've cleared all civilian traffic and have emergency crews standing by." Elena turned to Morrison, her voice calm and authoritative. "Follow my instructions exactly. We're going to use a military approach pattern that will compensate for our control limitations. The jets will guide us down using procedures that aren't in civilian manuals." Outside, the escort fighters maintained perfect formation, their presence transforming a hopeless situation into a controlled emergency with military precision backing every decision. The landing was unlike anything in commercial aviation history. Elena guided Captain Morrison through a military-style approach that used the aircraft's remaining momentum and the escort jet's precise positioning to compensate for the failed control systems. The runway appeared ahead, lined with emergency vehicles and military personnel who had mobilized within minutes of her authentication. As the wheels touched down with a jarring but successful impact, cheers erupted throughout the passenger cabin. The little girl who had first spotted Elena's wings pressed her face to the window, watching the F-18s peel away in perfect formation, their mission accomplished. Patricia appeared in the cockpit doorway, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Commander," she said, "the passengers want to thank you personally." Behind her, Elena could see faces pressed against the cabin windows, watching military ground crews surround their aircraft with professional efficiency. The businessman who had sat beside her pushed forward, his earlier dismissive attitude completely transformed. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. You saved every life on this plane tonight." Elena stood and straightened her jacket, the silver wings now visible to everyone. 20 minutes later, as passengers disembarked past honor guards who had formed spontaneously to salute her, Elena realized how completely the dynamics had shifted. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment, or if you've witnessed similar hidden strength in real life. The little girl was last to leave, stopping to salute Elena with perfect 6-year-old seriousness before running to her grateful parents, forever changed by witnessing true heroism hidden in plain sight.